I've had several people ask about the material here, so we had an opportunity over at Matt Perez's house a few weeks ago to kind of present this, and I figured it would be good now once I had it polished up to present it here. But people have asked, where did we get all the books that are in the Bible, and how do we know that they're the right ones? And then it seems like in the news every few months you'll see a little sideline thing. New book of the Bible discovered, that the gospel according to X, where X is some biblical name like Judas or Bartholomew or whatever, and this is a revelation and changes everything. And so the question then becomes, how do we know and how do we tell? And I think that's an interesting question that we need to ask, because we sometimes take it for granted, but on the other hand, the answer is a little messy, so we're going to kind of go through it tonight. But by the time we're done, I think you'll see that we can have faith in what we've got. That there were a lot of people doing a lot of thinking about this, and we're going to just kind of scratch the surface of it, but hopefully give you enough to give you an idea. So, what does the word canon even mean? Well, it just is an authoritative list of books accepted as Holy Scripture. That's an interesting definition, but it kind of begs the question. It's like, who gets to make the list? And, what kind of criteria are they going to use to make this list? And why isn't the list uniform? Some people have this list and other people have this list. And so that's the kind of things that we're going to look at tonight. And as we look at this study, there's some problems. First of all, this is a study of origins, of things that happened a long time ago, though we don't have a lot of documentation on. There's none of the original documents, and we'll show how a lot of that plays together as we go through tonight. And there's nothing that just goes, Jesus, just before he ascended into heaven, handed, Peter a list and said, okay, here's going to be all the books. That didn't happen. And so how did both the Old Testament and New Testament get put together? The evidence is sparse, it's sketchy, but a lot of people have been pulling it together. And I think as we see it, you'll see that we've got good reasons for the books that we have. So we want to start with a premise. First of all, you've probably heard of various councils, that had, Council of X, and there's been several of them that said, oh, we're the ones who made up the list. Are they the ones that get to tell whether or not a book is authoritative? How can you tell if a book is authoritative? What is the criteria for a book being authoritative? Let's put it that way. What's the criteria for a book being authoritative? Okay, it's got to be the writer, and it's got to be the writer who is what? Inspired. It's got to be somebody that God put down. So that's kind of our premise, is that the authority of a book doesn't come from being accepted, doesn't come from being in somebody's canon list. It comes from being inspired by God. And we've seen this chart before, but I wanted to just kind of go over it briefly here again. When God revealed two inspired men, and these guys wrote these things down, when we were looking at translations, we kind of went through this and said, okay, the autograph is what you call that original copy, the letter that Paul wrote, or the scroll that Moses sat in a tent and wrote on. Those are the originals, and they call them autographs. And we don't have any of them for any book. If we did, it would be really cool, right? Wouldn't you love to see Moses' signature on the bottom of the scrolls? But those things got copied all over the place, and the scribes were very careful in copying them. And for just the New Testament alone, we've got over 5,000 manuscripts that are copies of all or part of the New Testament books. There's at least that many, if not more, of the Old Testament as well. And so there's a lot of material there to work with to say, are those writings what they ought to be? But it still doesn't answer the question of, was that an inspired book? And then we come down to translations. But the interesting thing is, the evidence that we can tell if we're going to say, is the book inspired, we have to go through several things. First of all, we say, looking at the book itself, is it historically accurate? Is it geographically accurate? Those are some things that we can compare and look at. And if we find glaring errors that cannot be explained by the time or place that the book was written, and people get the wrong idea there. if, for example, they mention a city that we don't know where it is, would that be a geographic inaccuracy? No, because who knows? One of these days, archaeologist is going to stick a spade in the ground and find it, right? However, if they list a well-known city as being in one place, when we know good and well it was somewhere else, would that be a geographical inaccuracy? Absolutely. And so those are the kinds of things that people are looking for as internal evidence. But then, as you have books that you've decided are canonical, that are authoritative, you go there and you say, okay, then the scriptures being inspired by God are not going to contradict themselves. And so if you have something you're examining and you have others that are pretty well attested to, and you go, does this say anything different? Does this contradict things? Because it says now that we don't introduce different doctrines, right? And so anytime we get the newspaper article that says, we got a new book, and it changes everything that we know about the Bible, what do you kind of think of right off the bat? Not likely, because Galatians said if we or an angel from heaven reveals any doctrine or, that we don't already have, then they're going to be accursed. So clearly that's one thing you can do. It doesn't change any teaching of Christ. If you look over in Hebrews 1 where it talks about in old times he talked to us through the fathers and now through his son. So as we get all these things pulling together, we're going to find uniformity in all of these inspired books. And it doesn't contradict any of the apostles' doctrine. So we've got some verses that give us some clues, right, as we're looking through there. But also, you can look at external evidence. You look and you say, okay, when is my earliest manuscript? And do I have other people, maybe not even inspired people, but people well known in history, that have written about it or mentioned it that are in close proximity? And so when we get an author that says, I was talking to John and reading his books, then you go, oh, John wrote books, and we already know John the Apostle and the book that he wrote, and so we start getting that attestation, that provenance it's called, for understanding where the book came from and what time period and that kind of thing. So those are the kind of things we want to look at. As we start the journey, let's look at the Old Testament first, because it's interesting that there's no consensus among scholars about when the Hebrew Scriptures reached what they would call canonical acceptance by the majority of the Jews. Now, you think about that for a second and go, boy, how is that? Well, the Old Testament was written over a really long period of time. Moses is likely around 1450 BC, and Malachi is about 400 BC. So we got 1,000 years. And all during that 1,000 years, we've got some inspired writers cropping up every so often, and so there would be another one of these discussions about, was this a real prophet? Do we include his books? Do we copy his scrolls and include them in our, cache in the synagogue? And all of those discussions had to go on, and so they were quite used to it. By about 400 BC, we have other documents that talk about the 5 books of Moses. I mean, that's been, like a constant for forever. After that, you get about 200 BC that we've got lists of the prophets and things, and those dates are not when it was actually finished. That's dates of, we have a document dating from that time that lists things, that says we've got that. Does that understand the difference there? So that's not saying that's when those books were written. That's just saying that, we have a piece of evidence dating to then that gives us some lists and whatnot. And then by the time you get to the writings, what they're called, and we'll explain what all of that means, you get to about 100 AD, that we've got some lists for everything in it. And all of those we start putting together. We have to keep in mind that long period of time, but also the fact that the Jews were the keepers of this law. That was one of their jobs. And if you remember in Romans, the 3rd chapter, Romans 1 talks about all the Gentiles and their fall from God and the fact that they sinned. And then Romans 2 talks about all the Jews being just, you're just as bad as they were. And then Romans 3 says, the opening question is, then what advantage does a Jew have? And he says, well, much in every respect. Because to them, they were entrusted with the oracles of God. One of their jobs, you remember we talked about in Joshua as we were looking at the Levitical cities being, scattered all around, the Levites were responsible for making sure that people knew what the scriptures were, and they were the ones who were collecting things over time. And then the scribes, took on that responsibility, and many of them were Levites. So we get this sense that the Jews were responsible for all of that, and we get these quotes in the New Testament. I know we haven't talked about the New Testament yet, but this is how it kind of intertwines together. When Jesus was here, he talked about a lot of the Old Testament people. And I love this quote in Luke because he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Now, if you notice in a couple of slides back, I had this threefold thing of the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the writings. That's kind of the three divisions that the Jews have always kind of had. And sometimes they would call the writings, they would just refer to as the Psalms, because the Psalms was one of the biggest books in that category. And so when you look at their canon and what they considered to be authoritative, they have a lot of internal references between the books, right? You got things like Daniel saying, "I noticed when readings in the prophet Jeremiah the following," and you've got other people quoting Moses, and if you look at all of those cross quotes, you wind up with intertwining a lot of those books to start with, right? So they are attesting to each other that each one that came down in history was accepting the ones before it. You see what I'm saying there? So we got this kind of chain through history of them referencing, the inspired writers referencing the previously inspired books. And then by the time you get to the New Testament times, you get to Christ and the apostles, and they just quote from all over the place in the Old Testament. And so if we accept that Jesus was authoritative, then we look at the writings about him and his quotations, it begins to give us this picture of the authoritative Old Testament as well. So I know that kind of is a circular reference in some ways because we haven't talked about the authoritative part of the New Testament, but that's the whole point of them kind of blending together. Question, yeah? Absolutely. Yeah. And we will definitely see quotes from some of them as we go through. Fortunately, we've got some of those writings in the New Testament. We don't have the equivalent kind of quotes for a lot of the Old Testament writings, but we see that same pattern, right? Is that they were the keepers of the law, as it said in Hebrews, and we see that being brought forward. And then we see these references, where it talks about from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, and this is the one referenced by Isaiah the prophet, and that which was spoken of by Daniel. So we have all of these New Testament references back to those books that give us an idea that they were written. But there were other Jewish writers, and so for example, we're going to bring up one, Josephus, because he's kind of familiar to everybody. There are others, but we don't have as much that they wrote down. But I've got a rather lengthy quote from Josephus that I want to go through, because this is an example of the kind of thing that helps us understand what they believed during his time. Because Josephus is just giving us what he considers to be the common knowledge that the Jews have, right? And he was trained in the priesthood to begin with, so he had some training here. "We have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another as the Greeks have." Now, part of this is this is from his Against Appian. He's saying how the Jews have a much better view of God and the world than all of those Greeks do and all of the stuff that they've got, because they got all kinds of gods and contradictory stuff. And he's saying, no, we got this down. So we have only 22 books. And your first thing you think of is, how many books are there in the Old Testament in our Bible? Yeah. That's the New Testament. 39 in the Old Testament, right? 27 in the New Testament. 39 doesn't equal 22. But we'll see that math is a tricky thing sometimes. So we'll look at that in a second. Which contain the records of all past times, which are justly believed to be divine, and of them 5 belong to Moses. Woo! Which ones do you think those are? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? 5 books of Moses. And then he says, which contains his laws and the traditions and origins of mankind till his death. This interval of time was little short of 3,000 years, but as the time from the death of Moses till the reign of Artaxerxes, so he's given us a time span here, king of Persia, who reigned after Xerxes, the prophets who were after Moses wrote down what was done in their times in 13 books. Okay? And we'll see which ones those are in a minute, but notice that time break there. Xerxes, Artaxerxes, right? And he says the remaining 4 books contains hymns to God. Which one do you think those are? Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, okay? Song of Solomon. And precepts for the conduct of human life. It is true, our history has been written since Artaxerxes very particularly, but has not been esteemed of the like authority. Now that's an important statement, because the books written after Artaxerxes, and we'll finish this and then I'll show you a timeline, are essentially the apocryphal books. So those existed during the time of Jesus and during the time of the apostles, and they probably read them and had access to them. But Josephus is telling us here that those books, they didn't consider them to be what? Authoritative. Okay? They did not consider them to be inspired. So, because there's not been an exact succession of prophets since that time, and how firmly we give credit to those books of our own nation is evident by what we do. For during so many ages as have already passed, no one has been so bold as to either add anything to them, to take anything away from them, or to make any change in them, but it becomes natural to all Jews immediately and from their very birth to esteem these books, to contain divine doctrines, to persist in them, and if occasion be, willingly to die for them. How important did the Jews consider their view of the canon? And by the time it gets to Josephus, he says from birth, these are the books that we revere. Now, how do we count those things up? Well, let's look at the timeline real quick. Artaxerxes is down here, and if you remember, Esther is one of the books, is during the time of Xerxes, but then we have Ezra and Nehemiah and Malachi that are ending at right around almost 430 BC, and after that is when you see apocryphal books in about 200 BC start showing up. And so he says those are the books like the Maccabees and those kinds of things that were after Artaxerxes. So even Josephus gives us a nice hint there that says those books they didn't consider to be authoritative. All right, so here's how the books all came together. If you were looking at the Tanakh, the Rabbinic Hebrew Bible, you would see the Law, which is the first 5 books, and then you would see the Prophets Former, which they call Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And then you get the prophets later, which is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of 12. They just counted that as one book. What 12 do you think belong in there? All the minor prophets, right? Because they're small, and you're not going to make a scroll that's only, 3 columns long, so you just make a scroll that's got all 12 of them in there, and now you got a decent-sized scroll, right? And so a lot of that was based on what fit on a scroll that was manageable. And so then you get the writings, and I found it interesting that Ruth and Lamentations were part of the writings, and in Josephus' time, Ruth was tacked on to Judges. It wasn't separate. And we had Lamentations was tacked on to Jeremiah. Do both of those make sense? They actually do, right? Ruth was during the period of the Judges. Lamentations was written by Jeremiah. So that's how his count really matches the books that we have. Is that they just kind of stacked them a little differently and counted them a little differently. So that gives us a nice picture about the time of Christ, because Josephus is contemporary with that time period, right? Of how the Jews felt or what was part of the Old Testament canon. So then you've got these apocryphal books, but the earliest external references, the first time these show up in history is about the 2nd century BC to about the 1st century AD. And so those are, yes, around, but those are the ones Josephus says, that's after Artaxerxes. And those are the ones we're not real sure about as being authoritative. Okay, all that makes sense? Yeah. Yeah, okay, so that's a good question, and there's differing explanations. I should mention that there's several books written on this topic, and you can go get them, and they all disagree with each other, but they all come to basically the same conclusion. So I'm just kind of giving a meld here. But what happened was, we've talked about in the intertestamental period the Septuagint translation. Well, the Septuagint translation, they had the Hebrew of some sort, but it also included the apocryphal books. Those were just the Hebrew writings that had been collected. And they sent for the Hebrew scholars to come translate them into Greek. And they weren't concerned in that period on the Septuagint. The idea was get them translated in the library. They weren't trying to say these are authoritative. They were just trying to get them translated into the library. They translated the apocryphal books that they had, and they were all grouped together. And so when we get a later codex that is the Septuagint codex, guess what it has in it? All the apocryphal books. And so then in probably 500 and later, there's all this discussion at AD of are they in, are they out, those kinds of things, and lots of discussion that finally people agreed on and started looking at things like Josephus and saying, no, they didn't agree on them. But by that time, they had been included in several of the renditions, and we'll see that not even all of those are accepted. There's probably 4 major categories of what we call canon, and the apocryphal books show up in about 3 out of those 4. Yeah. Not new scripture, but what they do have is the Talmud was, which was they considered to be their oral tradition, was written down in the post-Jesus era. That's when the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud were codified. And so those are considered to be not the same class as Scripture, but they expound the wisdom of the early rabbis, and so are very much read and studied by the Jews as part of their religious texts. You can think of them as really, really important commentaries because they were written a long time ago. Yeah, the Talmud consists of 2 parts. There's the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah is a commentary on the Old Testament scriptures. The Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is the oldest part, and it's smaller, and then the Gemara is huge. I mean, there's just, it takes up a lot of space. And it has all kinds of rabbinical arguments in it, and it's kind of interesting because they'll go, Rabbi so-and-so said this, and Rabbi so-and-so said this, and sometimes it'll go, and we don't know which one is right, and then the other time they'll go, but everybody agreed, this guy, threw him out. So those were what developed after the time of Christ, but they still don't have the same level of authority. So they still feel the same way. They've got the Tanakh, the scriptures we just talked about. They've got the apocryphal books, which they consider to be writings for that time period, and then the Talmud, which is the later writings. There's some even later ones than that that get into Jewish mysticism and some other things, but that's kind of a fringe group. Any other questions? Okay. So when we get past the apocryphal books and we start looking at the Old Testament canon, there are a lot of ancient lists. In other words, people that started saying, oh, here's the books that we believe are part of this Old Testament canon. Some of them are Jewish writers, some of them are not Jewish writers. They were just ones who went and investigated. We don't have a lot earlier than in the 100 to 200 AD time period, because there's just not that many writings that survive from before that that are of this discussion. But I'm going to look at a few of them and just give you some examples. So we've got ranging from people like Melito and Origen and all of these guys here. Western, that's Eastern folks, Western tradition. We've got Hilary and Jerome and Augustine and so on. So as we talk about all of these guys, these are just people who happen to, we have one of their books or writings or letters, and they were going, oh, here's some books of the Old Testament, that they were referencing. So for example, let's get this going again. Whoops. This is from Eusebius's writing, okay, which he was around 265 AD, but he's quoting a guy named Melito, And we don't have any of Melito's writings. We just have Eusebius and other people quoting him. You see what I'm saying? So we're now, 3 removed here, but he is saying, Melito to Onesimus' brother, greetings, since you often desired in your zeal for the true word to have extracts from the law and the prophets concerning the Savior and concerning all our faith, and moreover, since you wish to know the accurate facts about the ancient writings, how many they are in number and what is their order, I have taken pains to do thus, for I know your zeal for the faith and interest in the word, and that in your struggle for eternal salvation you esteem these things more highly than all else in your love towards God. So he's writing to someone who's going, I really want to know the answer to the same question that we're addressing tonight, right? And so this fellow says, well, when I came to the east and reached the place where these things were preached, and apparently he did a lot of traveling over in that area, he said, I learned accurately the books of the Old Testament. I set down the facts and set them to you. These are their names. 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Joshua the son of Nun, Judges, Ruth. 4 books of Kingdoms, 2 books of Chronicles, the Psalms of David, the Proverbs of Solomon, his wisdom, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Job, the prophet Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 12 in a single book. There we go again. Who wants to list all minor prophets, right? And then you've got Daniel and Ezekiel and Ezra. And from these I have made extracts and compiled them in 6 books. So he went through, searching through, found all of these, made extracts from them, and shipped them off to copy them. And it took him 6 books just to put the extracts in. I always thought that was kind of interesting. But you see what I'm saying? Now we have somebody from a time period who was doing research and said, here's the ones I found that the people in this area consider to be authoritative. So there's a list. Now, does that make it the official canon? No, it's just evidence. It says these books were accepted as authoritative during this time period. All right. So in the Old Testament canon, this is right off of Wikipedia, so I'm just going to pop through it quickly. You can go look it up if you want to. But it kind of gives you an idea of, based on these categories, so we've got the Pentateuch and then the historical wisdom, major prophets, minor prophets. We've got the Hebrew Bible, the Protestant Old Testament, the Catholic Old Testament, and the Eastern Orthodox Old Testament are the 4 major categories that you'll find where people have slightly different books and orders and things that they've printed up and called their Bible. All right? So, everybody agrees on the first 5. Yay. Very good. As soon as we get to the next group, there's a little differences, right? So in the Hebrew Bible, they just arrange them a little differently, so that's all that means on that side. But the Hebrew and Protestant are the same books. It's just that we split Samuel into 2 parts, and we split, the Kings into 2 parts, and so on down the line in Chronicles. But on the Catholic book, you'll see you'll see Tobit and Judith in here in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Those are apocryphal books. Those were ones that were translated as part of the Septuagint, and which they then adopted when they were creating the Latin Vulgate, which was the Latin translation from the Greek translation, which was translated from the Hebrew. How's that for a lineage? But as you can see over here in the Eastern Orthodox, they got an extra 1 or 2 in theirs. There's a 3rd Maccabees, which most people haven't heard of, but it's even stranger than 2nd Maccabees. 1st Maccabees is actually a pretty good history book. If you haven't read it, it's one of the few apocryphal books I would say you ought to just go glance through it. It's not that long. It's good stuff. Oh, question. Yes, I'm sorry. Your peripheral vision here, you're going to have to move over. What you got, Ashton? If they have a Catholic printed Bible that says this is a Catholic Bible, it will have this in it. And if they have an Eastern Orthodox version, it will have those others in it. We don't even think about it because most of the bookstores we go to, we just pick up the one that's there, and that's essentially what's called, the world calls the Protestant version. All right? All right, so then you go into the wisdom books, and once again, we get an extra couple of them here. And an extra couple of them here that are included. We get out to the prophets, and now we've got this Baruch, and there's a letter of Jeremiah, which is a kind of a tag-on to Baruch, and it's accepted by the Eastern Orthodox but not by the Catholics. And then when we get to the minor prophets, yay, we're back to almost in sync again. They just call them the 12, but that list is pretty uniform for everybody. Okay, questions on that before we launch into the New Testament? All right, yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's a Greek name. I didn't look that up, so I know we've got it in the Book of Philemon or something very similar to it. I'd have to look and see. Yeah, yeah, I don't know. And sometimes it's hard to tell how common things are. When we have a lot of references to a lot of names, then they're, we know they're common, but sometimes some of the biblical names are just one-offs. Yeah, yeah. And those kinds of things we talked about when we were doing the translations and the trustworthiness of the manuscripts that we have, because there are a few verses, and if you look even in your Bibles, you'll find certain places, a couple places in the Gospels, a couple places in some of the other books where they'll say a verse is missing. I think in Matthew, Mark pointed one out on Sunday morning that his Bible doesn't have, but it's in others. And what that is sometimes a manuscript will have it and some don't. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll go, okay, which one's older? Which one agrees with the most copies that we have? Because we'll have like 10 copies of the book of Matthew. So if only one of them has a difference, then you start looking at it and going, maybe somebody threw something in that one, and we've got the other 9. And that's the way most of those kinds of things goes, is we have enough copies of them, 5,000 New Testament manuscripts. It's really hard for somebody to slip something in and have it propagated enough that it shows up in all of the copies, right? Yeah. There's none of them that are. All of them are things like, even the one in Matthew, it's a requote from something that's in Mark. That same verse is in Mark in the same story. So somebody may have been copying Matthew and Mark at the same time and, slipped the verse in as they had the story, but it doesn't change the story at all. Mark has 2 endings. Yeah, so Mark has 2 endings, and the longer one was in the Masoretic text, but it turns out once they got more and older documents, it wasn't in that one, so that was probably, no, Masoretic is Hebrew. Trying to remember the name of the unsealed that was in. I don't remember. I'll have to go back and look at it, but yes. So one that was used when the King James was translating, it was in there, but after the King James and later translations, the manuscripts that had turned up, in somebody's basement or some, monastery, some in the desert someplace, didn't have it. And so we do have a few of those, but it's really neat that we got enough copies that they just stand out, and so a lot of the translations, they'll just omit them, or they'll be in brackets, and they'll have the explanation there. Okay, New Testament canon. 3 stages in history. The Old Testament was written over 1,000 years. New Testament, much shorter time period, right? So we've got just during the lifetime of those with Christ that these books were appearing. And so it's a real compressed time period. It covers a time period of almost 100 years, with John as the last disciple that dies, and going from the birth of Christ, which was a little bit on the BC side. That's the time period that those books cover, but the writings are actually further up than that, right? Mark or Matthew is a toss-up. Some sources say one was first, some say the other, and they didn't appear until later on. We're looking at 50, 60, 70 AD, depending on where that falls, and the last one being about 90 AD. There's only about a 20 to 30 year period there that these books appear. And so what happens is the people are writing, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, who else? Paul, Peter, James, Jude. We only got 8 authors there. And then as these groups of letters and things start being bundled and circulated, we have those being collected and people recognizing them as writings of the apostles, as authoritative writings. And then they didn't really leave a record. Nobody got together and said, oh, I compiled 17 things in this book and, and put them all together and shipped them off to Ephesus. Or John, the last one to die, his last will and testament said, I've collected all the writings of everybody, and here's, and I have bequeathed them to my, nephew or whatever. So we don't have any of that, but we do have a lot of other things from that time period. So scholars disagree on when what was attached to what and how it was all collected and when it ever finally came in. What they don't disagree on when push comes to shove is which books are authoritative, which ones stand the test of time. Does that make sense? So how we got to that list, everybody's got a few different ideas, but the ones that are on the list, everybody comes to that same conclusion. All right, so let's look at a few things. Paul considered his letters to be authoritative. Yes? Absolutely. How can you tell? What did he say? Yeah. Didn't he say things like, follow my example, my instruction? And then he'd say, when you've read this letter, have it read in these other churches. Anyone that doesn't follow or obey the commands I've laid down in this letter, let him be anathema. I mean, so Paul considered his writing to be authoritative. And so that's the internal kind of evidence that we have. But by the beginning of the 2nd century, we find early Christians, and that's what Rob was referring to later, early Christian writers referencing them. And so for just a few minutes here, I want to put up some of these guys and look at some of the quotes. And then by the time you get to about 180 AD, we have our first list of New Testament books. And it's quite often referred to as the Muratorium Fragment. And some people consider it to be the first complete listing. If I remember correctly, it's still missing a couple of them, but it's still one of the most complete ones, and it is the earliest one that we have. But then you get, as time progresses, and by the time you get to the 4th century, lots of people have lots of lists of the New Testament books. All right, general guidelines followed by early Christians. How'd they figure out whether this was? Well, when you look at their writings, the first thing they want to do is say, do we know who wrote the book? And a lot of times it's called provenance, and provenance is an interesting word. Archaeologists talk about it a lot because what it means is, if I've dug something up, have I documented exactly where it was found, what layer it was in, who the guy was that dug it up, what site was, latitude and longitude of, where the thing was. Because people come up with stuff on the black market all the time, right? And they'll come up with this, this was a chalice that was, used by Jesus. And Constantine's mother, probably assembled several times the amount of material needed to reconstruct wooden crosses for Jesus, because everybody had a splinter of the cross. But provenance is important when you go, I know somebody who knows somebody, and they can attest to it firsthand. So it's still a chain that comes down, but we find these people referencing the New Testament writers. Was it consistent and clear apostolic teaching? Some of these later books that we get. Like there's a Gospels, infancy Gospels that are supposedly record the early life of Christ when he was a child. But they have things like him, creating a bird out of mud, and then when somebody sees it and he's upset at it, he curses them and their father dies. Like, does that coincide and line up with what we know in the Gospels about Jesus? And the answer is an obvious no. So what are we going to do with that book? In the trash, right? Not going to bother with that one. Was it used widely by the churches, or did it only have local recognition? And that's one of the ones that they started looking at for a couple of the passages in the books of James and Jude. And we don't have time tonight to talk about those, but those are still a couple of questions that some people have as to whether some of those chapters were originally written by those men. But again, when you start looking, as Joe said, at what those contain, it doesn't change anything, and it doesn't contradict anything. And so we almost reach a point where we go, okay, even if we toss that part out, it doesn't change anything. So those are the criteria that people tend to use. So let's look at a few quotes. Here's one from Papias. He's from 60 to 130 AD. Once again, he's quoted by Eusebius. We don't have any original writings. Eusebius collected a bunch of stuff and wrote it down in his ecclesiastical history. If ever anyone comes who had followed the presbyters, who are the presbyters do you think he's talking about there? Because we use that in a little different term. We use it as shepherds, but they used it as a term. That's how it's translated in this, for the apostles, okay, those who followed Christ. I inquired into the words of the presbyters, what Andrew or Peter or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any of the other Lord's disciples had said, and what Aristotle and the presbyter John, the Lord's disciples, were saying, for I did not suppose that information from books would help me so much as the word of a living and surviving voice. So there was an early guy, he said, yeah, I'll read the letters and I'll read the books, but what would I rather do? I want to sit at the feet of the people who were there, right? So take the books if you don't have them, but prefer to sit at the feet of the people. Is that a reasonable sentiment? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You know, and don't you still feel like that sometimes, that it would be just so wonderful to just sit at the feet, you know, listen to the lessons. And all we have to do now is read, and that's great. But one of these days we'll sit at the feet, right? Isn't that the goal? So these people treasured these early words. Now we got Justin Martyr, 150 AD. And on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gathered together to one place. This is the services that he's describing as they would have on Sunday. And the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. What's the two groups there? Yeah, so when he says the memoirs of the apostles, what would that be? New Testament books, right? How about the writings of the prophets? Old Testament books. So even there at 150 AD in the church services, they're reading the Old and New Testament books. That's what they're doing, as long as time permits. They probably stood around a lot longer than we're willing to stand around these days, you know, as they had these things read and explained. Then when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts the imitation of these good things. President is kind of a weird translation there of this particular text. It's the one presiding is the way that would literally be interpreted, as the one who is presiding then does these other things. And so we've got other passages that talk about what they did, but I like this one because it says we read from apostles' writings and we read from Old Testament writings. Here's Polycarp. Now, an interesting thing about Polycarp is we know that he was a student of the Apostle John. So we have someone who wrote who was a first-hand witness of John. What did he say? Neither am I nor is any other like unto me able to follow the wisdom of the blessed and glorious Paul. Kind of echoing what Peter said there, right? Peter said Paul sometimes wrote some things that are a little tough to understand. And he's agreeing with him. Who, when he came among you, taught face to face with the men of that day the word which concerned truth carefully and surely, who also, when he was absent, wrote a letter to you, into the which, if you look diligently, you'll be able to build up the faith given to you. Now, this is a letter that he wrote to the Philippians, because they had addressed him with some problems. And what's he essentially saying there? Go look at Paul's letter that he wrote to you. He's got the answers, folks. Right? So here's someone who studied under John who is referencing Paul's writings, and in particular, he's referencing the letter to Philippi. Quote from Irenaeus. He studied under Polycarp. Polycarp studied under John. Right? So we got this chain going here. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. While Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundation of the church after the departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what has been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. We have somebody who studied under John. What books is he listed there? First four gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's saying, I know where these came from. I know the people that wrote them. I'm only one generation removed here, and we know their work. See how that goes? And so we have witnesses along the line to the efficacy of these books. Yeah. Yeah. That's not what they're saying. And they are saying the authority is these guys. They were there. They wrote the books. Let's look at their books. And that's a good point. So those early writers, they're all referring back to the apostles and their writings. They're not trying to make up their own. All right. Quote from Irenaeus. We're running out of time rapidly. We've got one or two more to go. Truth is to be found nowhere else but in the Catholic Church, and by that, it just means universal. The sole depository of apostolic doctrine. Heresies are of recent formation and cannot trace their origin to the apostles. They were interested, even at that time, we're looking at 130 to 202 AD kind of time frame, of saying, can we trace this all the way back to the apostles? Do I know a person who knows the person who knows that this apostle wrote that? That's what they were trying to do. So even early. Since therefore we have such proofs, it's not necessary to seek the truth among others, which it is easy to obtain from the church, since the apostles, like a rich man depositing money in a bank, lodged in her hands most copiously all things pertaining to the truth. So this doesn't mention the specific books, but what does it say? We've collected those. We've got them together. We are now keepers of these books, and we're passing them around so that everybody can know what they are. And the date, we're not very far removed from the death of John. If John died at about it ranges anywhere from 90, 95 AD, people, guesstimate in there. And some of these writings appearing about 130, that's 40 years. These are people who would have known. All right. Quote from Gregory Thaumaturgus. And that the Holy Trinity is to be worshipped without either separation or alienation is taught to us by Paul, who says in his second epistle to the Corinthians, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Ghost be with you all. So, what book has he mentioned? 2 Corinthians. So, more than just a 1 Corinthians, he said, the second letter that he wrote. And there's more like this, okay? So almost every book in the New Testament has an early Christian writer who mentions it, or mentions something about it. And this is the last slide, and I'll let you go to some of these if you want to at some point. Part of what this all comes from is, we've got all these manuscripts collected, and, some of the ones that we start looking at of the books that we've got and how they're written. The four that I've got listed here are called the major unseals. These are the great unseals. What an unseal is it's a Greek text written in all uppercase with no spaces between so you know where the words start and stop, and no punctuation, and even columns all the way up and down. How's that for saving space, We don't want to lose any white space on precious parchment. But they're pretty cool because we've got some fairly old ones for the Old Testament. The Codex Sinaiticus was one that was found in the Sinai. It's the earliest and most complete manuscript. It contains the oldest copy of the New Testament. It includes two other books, Epistle of Barnabas and part of the Shepherd of Hermes, that they've included in the New Testament. Those books were not mentioned and did not appear until much later. This book is probably dates to about the 4th century AD. So between about the 1st century and the 4th century, guess what? Some of these other writings are starting to come in, just like some of the writings started coming in between Malachi and Christ. Does that make sense? And so we've got those copied in just like they did with the apocryphal books and the Septuagint. Guess what? They had them, they copied them into the book. Their concern was more getting them out and written down than it was trying to say that these are authoritative. But these are four of the big ones that are almost complete, have almost copies of almost everything. And it gives us a good idea by this early time period what was collected as part of the New Testament. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so really all we've been talking about tonight goes back to that first slide here. We're in this area. We're in the preservation phase, right? And what we look at is God's providence has kept all of this together for 3,000 years, if you start with Moses. That's a mighty testament to this all by itself. Oh, I am convinced. We even know, so there were letters mentioned by Paul that we don't have copies of, right? We've got Paul's writings and Peter's writings, who we know were big in that era. What we have to trust in is that God said we've been given all things that pertain to life and godliness, right? We've got what we need. Were there other stuff? Yeah. But apparently we didn't need it. I think even when I'm reading a lot of the books in Romans and Corinthians and I'm trying to digest some of the things that Paul's saying, I'm going, it would have been nice if somebody else had written on some of this or given us a little bit more information. but we have what we have. And James said, we've been given everything we need, right? Ashton. They're copies of copies of copies. We don't even know where they came from. Yeah, all a manuscript is a copy of something that originated at an autograph, but the likelihood is when the autograph came, they made multiple copies of it, right? And then those copies got sent out, and every one of those had multiple copies, so it's this huge tree that's branching out, and we've got bits and pieces scattered on that tree. We don't even have the whole line. But because we got bits and pieces, we can trace things back. In fact, they have done things like they found a mistake where somebody put like a wrong letter, dotted an I incorrectly or whatever, and that got copied. And you can tell the lineage of some of these because that one thing got copied out over, in some later period of time. So it's pretty interesting, but I think the thing I want to leave you with is just what we were saying. God said, I'll give you what you need. Holy Spirit came to the apostles, inspired writings to give us a New Testament. We had prophets and writers in the Old Testament. The Jews kept that religiously, and that's a good use of that word. It was their religion. It was what they needed to keep, and we inherited that. And then over a short period of time, we had New Testament books put together, and I think that's what Paul's referring to in Corinthians when he says, when that which is perfect has come. We've got it. We've got what we need.